Welcome to the Maverick Paradox podcast, where we explore what it is to be a maverick and discover effective modes of leadership. I am Judith Germain, and my mission is to propel the maverick mindset into a world where character and integrity will ultimately have a higher premium than personality and bureaucracy. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you would like to continue with me, then please subscribe to my podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or one of the other popular podcast platforms. Today, our guest is Bjorn Guldager. Welcome back, Bjorn.
Thank you very much, Judith. Thanks for having me.
I'm really interested in the type of people that have influenced your thinking in the past. Is that something you want to talk about?
Definitely. I had a huge injection of good names of people, writers, etc. from when I did my MBA with Henley Management College. My dissertation topic was how to achieve success in a turbulent market for professional services. You have to go through a reading list, and just a list of authors and titles, just 3-4 pages long. And you don't have to add a gram or an ounce of original thinking when you do your literature review, but you have to sift through a lot of thoughts by people. And I would like to highlight a couple of people whose thoughts I got introduced to at the time. One was Jim Collins. He's written the book From Good to Great. Unfortunately, many of the companies that he put in there as companies that were great, they have since failed and maybe no longer here. But he did still have some principles in his book that were very inspiring. And the one I want to highlight here is find out who you want to have in your bus, and then find out where the bus drives. Now, it's interesting to link that to maverick thinking, of course, because what if you have 5 mavericks on the bus and they all have their idea of where the bus has to go? That can lead to some complex situations. But the point is that sometimes you really need to simply have your team of people and say, I want to work with these people. And that's why you often see that when a charismatic leader from a company changes companies, a range of his professional followers may also switch to the same company. I've seen that happen. I'm sure you have, and I'm sure you as a listener have also seen that from time to time, simply because these people enjoy working together. They trust one another. They know how to play together. A small anecdote here is that John Lennon was post-Beatles was asked, do you miss the Beatles sometimes? And he said, there's one thing I miss, which is just looking over my shoulder to one of the other guys, that could be Paul, nodding, and then both of us would instantly know what that meant and where to go with that. That feeling of just knowing the ones you're with so well that you can just do stuff like that. So that takes a well-rehearsed band, and it would take a well-rehearsed organization to be able to do these things as well. And that's why it's great to travel on a bus with people that you actually like and respect. So that was one.
Can I just comment on that? I think that's really interesting that you say that the companies he was talking about don't exist or aren't as great anymore. And I wonder if that's a timing issue, because like now people are realizing it's all about the tribe. It's all about calling the right people towards you. That's more of a recent thing, isn't it? Compared to when he wrote the book, where people would have argued, let's know where the bus is going before we fill the bus with people. There's more of a shift now where people are beginning to realise it isn't just a bunch of techniques. It isn't a bunch of processes. Yes, it is those, but it's also the individual. Because one of the things I've noticed a lot, and I talk about in my book, that quite often socialised mavericks will take the company vision, translate it in a way that their followers can understand, and lend their reputation to it. So people get drawn towards them. But then when they leave, though, the organisation can't fill that translation gap and that personality and integrity, moral value gap. So the employees suddenly go, actually, I don't like working here anymore. It's not the company I thought it was, because they've been shielded by that maverick in the middle, and then they leave. Could you see how that might happen?
I think one of my keywords is really balance between, sometimes opposing influences or forces. And one force, of course, is constant. We have earlier discussed how some parts of leadership is constant and others, may be cultural dependent. And here I could highlight, that there may be industry cycles, which means that it's relevant or not so relevant for certain types of people to be at the helm or even with the company. So the same company may be going through different cycles of the industry. And also there may be the general development, often on the technology side, but it could be legal side, the whole external environment, which then sometimes forces a company out of business simply because their technology is no longer the right one, even though that they were well led at the time and within the general market cycle. So all of these things can play an influence. So constant things, industry relevant things, and then the disruptors. And of course, we are seeing, everybody says the only constant is change, and we're seeing an increased rate of it. So we have to factor in what we want to stand by forever, what the cycles that our companies and industries are going through, and then the forces that come from outside. And all of these play a role in determining whether you are the right team on the bus, and if the bus is indeed going in the right direction. Make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Cool. So what's your next one?
Yeah, maybe that's a more brief one, but it's a great one. The gentleman's name is Tom Lambert, and he's written a couple of books on consulting back from the 90s. So some of this does not take the internet and a lot of new things into consideration, but he does outline a 6-step plan for how you actually achieve sales as a professional services provider, which should be of interest to many of us, either because we're doing it or because we are subject to it. So it's good to know about these things. And he also has a saying that really has stuck with me, and it is that there are many, many more good consultants out there than there are successful consultants. And I think this statement applies to many, many fields of life. At the bottom of it, I think we have to love our work. We have to develop talent around it so that we have a good product. But we cannot be ignorant to the packaging of the product either. So you've got to be mainly product, but and definitely you have to have your product first, in my opinion. But you also have to consider looking good and packaging your product or service in a way that people can identify with it, relate to it, connect with it, and buy it. So if you don't consider these things, you may be a very good consultant, but you may not be a successful one. You may be an unrewarded genius because you didn't link your talent and passion to skills and reputation, all these things that are also required for your product or service to be purchased.
Yes, I certainly can get that. I do mentoring with business owners, and that is a key part of making sure that it's defined and linked. So, because what I've found in the past, a lot of people, look at things from a marketing perspective, but that means that they can be, in terms of defining what they do, but it can be quite shallow, doesn't go deep enough. And I think it's that kind of linkage that you were saying that guy's talking about. So that makes sense to me.
Okay. Now, my initial submission of the names of people that I wanted to research when I did this literature review back then had an omission, and my dissertation proposal, I actually had it returned with one remark. Since it came from England, I may have to switch to a more British accent when I quote the remark, which was, dissertation of this type can be considered complete without having read at least 2 books by David Meister. So I said, who's David Meister? And then I found out that I really needed to know about David Meister. He's a very influential person with a lot of books, either written or co-written by him. And one example is his concept of being the trusted advisor. And I've seen, many people taking that concept and putting into their own headlines, thus maybe just saying, hey, I'm a trusted advisor. Of course, you have to do some work to actually become that, but he goes into depth about that. So I would definitely mention his name as well. That was the biggest unexpected bonus of doing my MBA dissertation, was to come across him at that point. He's definitely worth it, reading a couple of books by him. And just like with the rest of them, you can probably go to anywhere, Amazon or different websites, to find out what are the most popular books. And they are probably good books to start with, to grasp some of their concepts. I have 2 more just to make it a whole handful, because that was 3. And one is a quick comment on what happened in my literature review. And this is not a shameless plug. It's actually because I think it may be interesting to the listener. And it reinforces my point about how you cannot apply the same parameters to an organization all the time. So because from this literature review, I identified 40 different parameters in 8 different categories that are all important to somehow have an approach to, or maybe a measurement or whatever it is, if you want to have complete grasp of, say, a larger organization. Maybe as a one-man band, you don't need to think about it all the time, but all of these were actually important. So this came from the literature review. Now you also have to actually apply some original thinking to your dissertation. That comes in the second part, and my research was then on how do the relative importance of these parameters vary when the market is very good, so that demand is bigger than supply. Stable, so that they about equal each other, either on a high level or low level, but at least stable. And contracting, or bad, as if you will, where now the supply of services is bigger than the demand, because the demand has gone down when the economy is bad, etc. So, and that reveals some very interesting things about what is important for a company to focus on when the market is or is perceived to be good or bad. And very briefly, the conclusion was that in good times, you really, really, for instance, you value companies and you hire people based on their potential. The one parameter that was called access to talent was way above the other 39 parameters in terms of importance when the market was good. But when they were stable or bad, then that parameter it became less important because it was easier to get it. So it's not as much a determining factor for your success. Whereas when the market is bad, you want to value companies and hire people based on their already proven performance. So you don't want to hire this guy just because you think he might be good in 2 years. You want to hire him or her because they have already done exactly the job and they can prove that they're good at it. So, and a company will turn its attention to their processes, for instance, to make the leakage smaller, whereas otherwise you may focus more on the marketing and the learning, the training of staff to make your bucket bigger so that it can contain more water, in good times. But in bad times, you want to make sure that your bucket doesn't have too many holes in it. So you employ other measures or you focus on other measures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's probably what we're seeing now, actually, thinking about it. Whereas in the past, you used to recruit, say, 75% capability in the role. Whereas now you see people who are recruiting people that are overskilled for the role.
Yes, I mean, that I would take as a sign that the market then was either in a downward spiral or heading towards one. Actually, here in Denmark, the market is currently perceived to be quite good. So this may be different across companies. I'm not going to pull any Brexit jokes here, but, it could be related to something like that then causes some uncertainty, say, particularly in one country as opposed to maybe another country. But when that starts to happen, then according to what I just said, I would perceive that as you go into a crisis or contracting market mode, and you prepare yourself for that. So you don't want to hire people just on their potential, but on their proven performance. I hope this brief introduction to all that was inspirational. That was really, the sum of a lot of great thinkers. And at the end, there was a little bit of original thought applied to it as well. So I would, of course, also like to highlight some of your work, Judith, to make this handful complete. So you're joining a great band of people here, with your Maverick books, the Maverick Paradox and the concept about willful independence. I think that's a great contribution. And I'm sure that a lot of people subscribe to you because they already agree with that. Otherwise, I hope that they will, because you explain that very well. And the distinction between two types of Mavericks, I think, is a great one. I want to be socialized and influence? Do I want to occasionally manipulate my way, or do I want to stay out of it? If I am maybe actually a little more extreme than I probably should be, what are the measures that I can take? And you split that, you have tables in your book that sort of really highlight how the differences are. And probably for most people, they can take that table and find one or two traits of themselves in the extreme column and say, okay, maybe this is the one I should work on. So you can actually apply a pretty concrete development plan for yourself if you want to by taking some of your work there. So I would like to include that in here as well. And of course, I've left out now 90 or 100 people, but I've put a couple of good ones in there, and I hope that they prove inspirational for you and for the listener.
Yes, thank you for that review, and thank you for the kind comments. I think it's quite interesting. I was doing a training program on leading change and applying Maverick leadership to it, and the group of managers were looking at the 4 different types of individuals, and one of the things that they said was, wow, I can understand why the staff get upset, because when I'm annoyed, I flip straight to extreme Mavericks and I do this, this and this. How do I resolve that? So it's quite interesting, because as an observer, you would not have put them in the extreme Maverick space, but they could recognise that there were certain triggers that they went straight to it and lived there for a while. So it was interesting being able to give some strategies to how to avoid living in a space that is uncomfortable for the individual that they're leading, but also uncomfortable for the actual manager, because they don't feel that that's where they should be. So it was quite interesting.
Yes. And you may recall from our earlier conversation on the last podcast that sometimes Scandinavian leadership style will go from being a very, very trust-based one and then into what you could call an extreme maverick, that really has to manipulate and overly control what goes on. And if they were aware of that and could then say, what can I apply from, say, the socialized maverick toolbox that may actually enable them to have a better toolbox at their disposal at that time, in a project or in a company situation where that type of leadership may actually be a more valuable one and more useful one for the company and for the person themselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because quite often people look at trust as just character. But it's not just the character, it's also the intention, but it's also the competence, whether the person can be competent, whether they've got a track record. So there's like 4 dimensions in trust. It's not just character. And I always think that if you trust someone to do something and they let them down, then what you trusted them with was wrong in the first place. So it's still the fault of the person that has given the trust, not the fault of the person who didn't fulfill it, but in a work environment. So I always think that you need to be clear when you delegate stuff that the person can achieve it. They might need to stretch to achieve it, but you shouldn't be putting them in a position where they're going to fail.
Yes, I may put a small modifier on that, if I may. Maybe that's for the listener also to reflect on what they think should be done in terms of trust. The saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. So just because you trusted somebody with a task and they let you down once, well, actually, it doesn't mean that it was their fault or it was your fault. You really have to look at the situation. So any breach of trust may be also explainable by other circumstances.
Yes, of course. I'm thinking more likely that you've got a task and you've delegated to a member of staff to do it, but you didn't check that they were actually capable. You just said, do this. You didn't check they understood. You didn't check they had the resource. You didn't check any of that stuff. You've just completely delegated it to somebody.
Yeah.
So I suppose if you use the situational leadership model you talked about before, you would be maybe using a laissez-faire sort of style when somebody needed to be directed.
Yeah, but I think the key phrase, generally is situational leadership and also for Maverick, to not just know what they want to be like, but also what the situation calls for. But actually that inspires me to maybe move from a handful and include another person or two into this here at the end. Mm-hmm. And one of them is a 3,000-year, I believe, old book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which in the 90s was sort of reissued with a business context. And it's still being brought up from time to time. And there's an example from the book that I could just mention here very early on, where the highest general commander, issues an order or asks his general to issue an order, and the soldiers do not follow it. And then he says, okay, maybe I didn't, make myself clear enough, so nobody gets punished or hurt or something like that. Then he issues the command again to his generals. The soldiers do not follow the order. He has the 2 highest ranking generals executed. And everybody said, no, they're trusted people. They've been here 30 years. They are very good. Everybody looks up to them and said, if I issue an order and it's not followed, and I'm sure that my order was clear and understood, then this is what happens. And so that happened. This doesn't link well with our Western way of thinking. But the point is, there were no orders that he ever gave again that were not followed. Because people knew what the consequences were, And so I'm not recommending this as a general leadership quality. But the point is, what we can use it for is to first check whether it was your own order that was not clear. So don't blame somebody else initially. Then second time, there may be consequences less adverse than this one. But if your orders are clear and you've checked that, and they're not being followed, then you need to really find out something needs to be fixed down the line then. Because otherwise you will lose your authority. Yeah. So that is also a book to read and again, proceed with caution, do not apply all the things or try that. And also this review would not really be complete, Judith, without just having a quick mention of originally a self-help book by Stephen Covey, but the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one concept from there that he didn't actually invent, but which is so often attributed to him that people think that he invented it, was the time management matrix of things that are urgent or not and important or not. And where it's pretty easy for us to know that things that are urgent and important should take higher priority than things that are not urgent, not important. And yet we still procrastinate and play games or do Scrabbles or things like that, either because the mind needs a little break or because we're just a little afraid of tackling the big things. So that is one, but at least it's easy for people to make that distinction. The hard distinction is to make a priority between what is urgent but not important and important but not urgent. And almost all of us will go into what is called the quadrant 3 activity, which is the urgent one, but not really important, the firefighting, the one that makes us think that we saved the day for somebody. We were superheroes. But the important work that's not urgent is the work that prevents future fires from happening. And it's the very often overlooked one. And, he described that very well in his book. So therefore, to make this complete, I would like to just also mention that book. I think it still has a lot of relevance in today's world as well.
Yeah, I agree. I like his work. I mean, I think in that particular last example, it takes courage to do that. And a lot of people don't have the courage to stand up to the person that's shouting, this is important. They'll just do it when there's something that is more important that needs to be done. My favourite principles is start with the end in mind, I think. I think that's definitely my go-to. It's like at the beginning of stuff, what's the point of this? Where do we want to be? And I really find that I can't move forward until someone's really properly described what the end result should be.
Yeah. And that is his second habit out of the 7. And for anybody who are not familiar with the habits, then, the 3 first ones are the journey towards independence, really about growing up and being a strong I person, where if you don't have those habits, you will often find yourself blaming others for your situation. You will be a you person, like you made me angry, or it's your fault that I didn't become whatever.
Oh.
So those 3 first habits, where you quoted one, takes the person on a journey from you to I. And the second set of habits, the next 3 ones, take you on a journey from independence to interdependence, from I to we, which is really, really essential if you want not just to be a strong person, but to be functioning well in a team-based, company-based, whatever, project-based context. So that's the journey from I to we. And then the 7th habit is sharpen the saw, as he calls it, which is to be sure that you keep practicing the other 6 habits, because it's not a do it once and then it's all done forever, like set and forget type of thing. So those were his 2 journeys that he describes in the book. I would add to that there is a journey, and I'm not using his words here, I believe. I think it's my interpretation of them, but hope you all can live with that, is the journey from we to they. He does have an 8th habit, finding your voice. And that's part of finding your legacy that you want to leave behind, which is also a topic that Roger Hamilton, also an influential person in the world that we have been in, Judith, touches upon. It's not just what you do now or as a person or the team you do it with. It's also the people that you do it for, and whatever you leave behind when you are not here anymore. A topic from that is actually why motivation, that requires you to be there. Inspiration, that can continue even when you're not here any longer. That's why the great philosophers or even religious figures, they're not called motivators. I call them inspirators, and it's maybe grammatically not a correct word, but they are inspiring people. They were not motivating people these days. And that's what we can all aspire to be. And it's actually one of the reasons why the word inspire is a key part of my vocabulary, because I would like to be part of something that remains even when the project is done, or even when I'm not here anymore. And I hope we can all do our little part, both to be good while we're here and also to leave something that lasts when we don't.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think that's a great place to end. Once again, a fantastic podcast. Thank you, Bjorn. And I hope you come back many more times.
Well, be happy to do it. Thank you very much for having me again.
You're welcome. Thank you once again for tuning into the Maverick Paradox podcast. I hope you have enjoyed listening to my conversation with Bjorn as much as I enjoyed having it. If you would like to learn more about Mavericks and leadership, then please subscribe to my podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or one of the other popular podcast platforms. Alternatively, apply to join the Maverick Paradox exclusive Facebook group. My website is maverickparadox.com. Find out how willful independence can ultimately change all our futures. Thanks again, and see you soon.